So thank you so much for having me today. Again, my name is Tiffany Ng, and I am the Green Zones Program Manager at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA. And I'm gonna apologize in advance because I'm getting over a cold, so I'm gonna try my best to speak clearly and not be super stuffed up, even though I know I'm probably gonna be talking for about 15, 20 minutes. But I don't have any jokes. My conversation might come off as kind of a bummer, but I think it's actually really exciting and it's a different opinion. So I really hope you enjoy some of the content and different perspectives that I present today. Let's see, no, this way, okay. So CEJA stands for, again, the California Environmental Justice Alliance. We are a statewide alliance that works on environmental justice policy solutions by working with 10 different member and partner organizations across the state of California. So some of you might be familiar with the groups that are in the Southern LA or National City, San Diego region, but we have groups in the Bay Area, in the Central Valley, on the Center Coast, in the Inland Empire, in the LA region, and also in San Diego. So all of our groups are grassroots-based organizations that fight for environmental justice within their particular regions. But our job is to come together to fight for these bigger picture policy solutions that can really create institutional change. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about, as we talk about climate justice, we have to also talk about what is environmental justice, right? This big umbrella term that encompasses issues like climate. There's very technical definitions of what EJ is, but for us, from a people's perspective, EJ is about the basic right of people to live, work, go to school, play, and pray in a healthy and clean environment, right? That makes sense to a lot of people, but obviously this doesn't happen very equitably. So again, one thing that we have to talk about when we talk about EJ or climate justice is this concept of equity. And what does equity really mean? Because I think sometimes we get confused with what is equality versus equity. And equality, of course, is a good outcome that we all want. We all want to have equal access to resources, equal access to opportunities. But what happens is that sometimes we confuse what's needed versus equal treatment. We're not saying that everyone should be treated the same way. We're saying that everyone should be treated fairly based on their background, based on their resources, and based on opportunities. So I'll give you an example. And I'm gonna try to use a SoCal example, but say you have Palos Verdes and you have Huntington Park. If you were to use community resources and say both cities should receive the exact same amount of resources, that might not make the most sense because the two cities are very different cities. They have different histories, they have different budgets, they have different tax bases, they have different legacies of land use and even discrimination. So you might want to think about how do we distribute resources in an equitable way to really give people the things that they need that are most appropriate versus treating everyone the same, right? And that's the fundamental concept, these concepts of equity justice that climate justice is really based on. So to take us a step back to some history, while people think of EJ as a recent phenomenon, it actually has very deep roots in a lot of different movements. It has deep roots in the civil rights movement, which took a look at racial inequality and economic inequality and gender inequality and said we need to address environmental issues through those lenses. So we're not saying that everyone is going to be treated equally. We want to achieve equality, but we have to do that through different methods, right? So it uses, it was about addressing environmental racism. And so what happened was through the years, people were seeing examples of environmental racism in different communities across the country. And so what happened was in 1991, people came together at this first National People of Color Environmental Summit to talk about what are these basic principles that we want for environmental justice. So if you can see, there's 17 different principles, but one of them is that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any discrimination or bias. EJ, or environmental justice, mandates the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land and renewable resources in the interest of a sustainable planet for humans and other living things. Environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, and enforcement evaluation. So you can go through the document if you have some time to really look at what are these principles of environmental justice that feed a lot of the work that's happening today. And it's rooted in different movements. So it's rooted in like the labor union movement. It's rooted in like, farm workers and their struggle for rights, working on the farm. It's rooted in indigenous community struggles. It's rooted in people of color struggles, working class community struggles, right? It's multiracial, it's inclusive, and it really talks about this need for justice. So when we talk about, again, climate justice, we have to really look at our history and recognize that some communities, especially low-income communities, and especially communities of color, are more likely to be impacted by certain kinds of impacts, whether they're environmental or very specific to climate. And this is due to a lot of policy making and decision making. So one real big issue for us is inappropriate land use planning, where you're citing, for example, facilities, like toxic facilities, emitting facilities next to people's homes and schools and senior centers. There's long histories of discrimination in certain communities, like thinking back to redlining all the way to today until you have discriminatory lending practices where people were denied the ability to gain wealth and have access to homes and were pushed into certain parts of cities and communities where they had lack of access to resources. There's also a real big issue of whose voices get considered in the room, whether or not local residents have the power to impact policy, or whether they're listening to, frankly, like bigger corporate interests with more money and more clout. So a lot of these things contribute to what kinds of climate policy and environmental policy that we have today. One study that we worked on recently with some researchers from USC and UCLA showed that when it comes to climate issues, these issues fall along a lot of race and class lines. So for this study, it showed that when it comes to GHG emitting facilities, they are more likely to be located in communities of color and low-income communities. In fact, communities within 2.5 miles of a greenhouse gas facility are 22% high proportion of people of color and 21% high proportion of low-income folks. So you can see that there is like a trend towards putting certain facilities in certain neighborhoods. The other thing we have to talk about is disparate climate impacts, right? So when it comes to issues of extreme heat or flooding, when it comes to wildfires or drought, these are going to have different impacts on people depending on their background and resources. So we have to ask questions of who has access to air conditioning and cooling, who has access to tree canopies and shade, definitely certain communities more than others. Who is going to be more likely to be susceptible to unsafe working conditions, right? Those are things that we consider when we think about heat. With flooding, we think about, the fact that some people lack certain kinds of sidewalks and infrastructure, that there's a lack of drainage, and that there's mudslides that affect homes and people's workplaces. For fires, we think about who has access to certain kinds of insurance for their homes or even like healthcare. Who is going to be more susceptible to smoke inhalation? Who has access to masks? And who's more likely to have asthma rates? You can definitely see in a lot of low-income communities that there's a lot of people who have high asthma that they gain through being, exposed to so much pollution and toxins. And then, of course, drought. For a lot of rural communities, there's an issue of access to clean drinking water because they don't always rely on municipal services. They can't do that. They rely on groundwater and wells. There's also the issue of employment for workers who work in agricultural industries or industries that focus on water usage. They might not have their jobs when it comes to the time to really support and take care of their families. And of course, as some people really have seen through the fires, disaster relief and recovery, while it's trying to help everybody, needs to be tailored to address different segments of our communities, of different segments of our population. So access to shelter and aid, some people, it's great that you can go to another home or you have networks of people that in your family that can house you. A lot of people who don't are, forced to go into shelters. For undocumented immigrants who were affected by the fires, they didn't feel safe going into shelters, feeling that they might be deported. So they're more likely to have really bad, negative, harmful effects on their health. on their ability to get a job and their ability to get shelter. So these things become exacerbated over time. These things are really things that we can pay attention to. But the good thing is that people are starting to pay attention to these things, right? Like, has anybody heard of a DocuFund? All right. So a DocuFund is basically a way in which people came together to pool their money and resources together to set aside money for undocumented immigrants who are hit by wildfires. And that's one way that people are taking action, is saying that we know that there's government systems in place to take care of people, but we want to actually get involved and help people out by creating our own systems to like take care of ourselves as a community. This is an example that you might have seen in Southern California or other parts of the state where farm workers, even when there's fires happening, were forced to work in the fields. And some of them, most of them, as you can see, weren't even allowed to have masks on. So, you know, can you imagine people fleeing their homes and fleeing the fires when people are told to do their job because they're told that the crops need to be picked up really quickly or else we're going to lose a lot of money for this company, right? There's also people who, you know, there's some good companies too. Some companies told people, we need to make sure you go home. There's some people who are saying you can wear masks until a certain point and then that's unhealthy and then you can, you know, leave. But for a lot of workers, they're the ones who are hit first and worst by these impacts of climate change, right? They're the ones who have the least amount of protections and resources to adapt and take care of themselves when these things hit. So one thing that CEJA worked on was a bill called AB 1124 by Senator Mainshine, which basically required OSHA to adopt an emergency regulation to protect workers from smoke during wildfire events. So while we pushed this bill forward, what the great thing was that OSHA actually stepped in to start creating like a rulemaking process to push these kinds of protections for outdoor workers so that we didn't have to move forward with a bill. But that's one way in which people can get involved to like really make concrete changes in people's lives. So what does it take to achieve climate justice? This is kind of a rubric that we use when we assess whether agencies or departments or local governments are really doing right by communities, that uses an equity and a justice lens. So we'll ask questions like, does this law or policy, does this agency or department really prioritize and value prevention? Does it protect human health? And does it improve quality of life for everybody? Do you make sure that whatever strategy that you're using does not do any harm, does not create unintended consequences? Do you prioritize EJ communities? And what I mean by EJ communities is these communities that are hit first and worst by climate and EJ issues, like, which tend to be low-income communities and communities of color. Are you meaningfully engaging the community that's most impacted because they have a lot of knowledge and expertise to inform decision making? Are you proactive? Are you waiting for people to come to you and like, you know, you respond to them? Or are you actually reaching out to people to go to them because you know that they are disconnected and need to be engaged in these decisions? Are you taking an intersectional approach? Are you thinking of things through like a different lens of different social lenses like race or income or gender or immigration status or national origin status? Are you responsive, inclusive, accountable, and do you respect community expertise? I think a lot of times, you know, people say like, well, I've been doing this for so many years. I have a degree in this and this and this. I know exactly what's happening. But I think what we all recognize is that when we come together as a group from different perspectives and different expertise, we actually create better solutions that are more well-rounded. So let's listen to the planners, let's listen to legislators, let's listen to teachers and academics, but let's also listen to residents. Let's listen to people who are on the ground who are most impacted by these issues. One thing that we really try to talk about when it comes to climate solutions and environmental solutions is that while we think of GHGs as, you know, impacting the globe, right? Like there's no boundaries for like greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is that impacts can be very localized, right? So when we're telling Richmond, oh, you know, you have to go under certain regulations, are those regulations necessarily making sure that the local Richmond community that's mostly low income, that's mostly black and brown, is really going to be served by those regulations? Or are they going to be kind of the collateral damage, you know, of like these policies that are supposed to protect everybody, but they really protect a few people over others, right? So a lot of times if you know anybody from Richmond, California who lives in the shadows of the Chevron refinery, they'll say things like, yeah, we see explosions all the time. We see fires happening all the time. We have particulate matter on our windowsills and in our garden. Like, you might be doing policies to help, but they're not helping us. And really, we have to be asking who is benefiting and who's losing. These are things that we do really suggest. Like, you know how someone talked about subsidies and where our money goes? Well, how about funding climate solutions that really do work? So this is a way in which these programs make sure to serve at least a certain percentage of low-income communities and communities of color, what's called disadvantaged communities in our state of California, so that they can have benefits to things like EVs, right? Like who has access to electric vehicles, who has access to affordable housing, who has access to active transportation infrastructure. So these are the kinds of programs that build those solutions in the places where people really need it. So Transformative Climate Communities is a really great program that looks at community development from a holistic perspective. So you're putting housing next to transportation, next to gardens, next to community college access. So like you're thinking of things from a systems perspective. There's urban greening, which really tries to, as people have mentioned many times before, like do more access to parks and planting trees and having more green space. There's the low-income weatherization program. We talked about the need to like have energy efficiency and weatherization. But a lot of times those things don't happen if you don't have the money to afford those kinds of retrofits, right? So this program actually makes sure that those kinds of benefits go to low-income communities of color. Lastly, solar on multifamily affordable housing. Like who can have access to solar? Well, this program says if you're in a disadvantaged community, again, you can have access to solar on your multifamily affordable housing, and those benefits go back to residents. One thing we do want to show is that it's really important to have community engagement throughout any time you're making any kinds of decisions or policy change. So there's many reasons why it's important, which of course you can read on the slide. But we want to make sure that when you're doing public engagement, you're not just doing it haphazardly. You're not going to be like, I'm going to have a meeting in downtown Oakland, where I'm from, and just expect everyone to come there and just listen to my like hour-and-a-half lecture on like certain issues, right? Like that's not very accessible to people. So think about ways in which people feel more included. Like, do you have childcare? Are you transportation accessible? Are you meeting during the hours where people actually can go? Are you meeting during people's work hours? Are you meeting in locations that are community friendly? Like instead of going to downtown, can you actually meet in a church, or like maybe near a farmer's market, or somewhere where people really gather? So there's different ways in which you can do community engagement that really make sure that people who have knowledge can engage in the process. And it's not like people have all the skills and training to do this work, right? Like sometimes it's also about capacity building TA and making sure that when you're doing community outreach, you're actually building people's knowledge and skills to make informed and meaningful decisions. One thing that people can take a look at later is the International Association on Public Participation, or IAP2. They have a scale to which shows that what kinds of community engagement and public participation is really meaningful, and at the different levels of it. So at the very bottom, you have like things like just informing people, like you have a decision, you inform people, versus something that's more around empowerment and decision making, where people are the final decision makers in certain kinds of lawmaking procedures. This, again, I can send more information later because I know we're running out of time, but this is a bill that we worked on last year to change the definition of environmental justice for the state of California. And one thing we wanted to say is that when it comes to EJ, it's not just about fair treatment, right, which is definitely important, but it's also about the meaningful involvement of people in all levels of decision making and making sure that the people most impacted are included and their voices are considered. So what about solutions? Which solutions are good and which solutions are false? Like, I think that one thing that we want to check is that sometimes when we're trying to make climate solutions, we might have unintended consequences. So for those who are familiar with California policymaking, you know that for the past few decades, the state has been working on a number of laws to really impact climate, to put a dent in our climate change impacts. So one of the biggest laws that people might know about is AB 32, which created a host of different strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California, which has been modified over the years through laws like SB 32 to create better targets for reducing greenhouse gases. SB 535 and AB 1550 are two big pieces of legislation that made sure that we put a certain amount of money towards low-income communities and communities of color, again, disadvantaged communities, to make sure that they receive the kinds of protections and investments that everyone else has access to. And there's a number of things that are coming up recently that you can take a look at and really research. For example, AB 1839, I believe by Assemblymember Bonta from the Oakland Bay area, is working on a Green New Deal resolution to create values and principles for how we push forth this idea of a Green New Deal. And one bill that CEJA is working on is AB 345 with the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment, or CRPE, that works in Delano, California. And that bill is trying to create a health and safety setback with oil and gas operations, because for the state of California, there really aren't a lot of laws saying, like, if you have like an oil well or like a natural gas, extraction site, there needs to be any, setback from homes or, more sensitive land uses. So this is trying to create legislation to create some kinds of basic protections for people. And as you probably heard many times before, there's definitely parts of our economy and sectors that contribute to more greenhouse gases than others. When you take a look at it, transportation provides a huge amount of our greenhouse gases, right? Next, you have like industrial facilities, and you have also electricity generation. So given these stats on where greenhouse gases are really coming from, we are, our state has really entered in thinking about supply side and demand side solutions. So one example that you might have heard of is the low carbon fuel standard. That's trying to get ways for our state to, use energy that's going to be like less GHG emission intensive. You also have SB 100, which is trying to make sure that when it comes to our renewable portfolio standard, or the way that we use, and produce energy in California, that more of that energy production comes from renewable sources over time. So I think while these are great steps in the right direction, like there's definitely some good things that are coming about it, and we're reducing GHGs and emissions. The biggest challenge is that we also need to go farther, right? Climate change has huge impacts. We know that we are quite behind, and when we talk about low carbon, why aren't we talking about net zero carbon, right? Like, why are we talking about like it's kind of less worse than it was before? We need to talk about making things actually a lot better. So we really try to push legislators and decision makers to go farther than just less bad than before. I won't talk about this too much, but there's definitely talk about cap and trade. That's been a real big conversation when it comes to climate policy in California. And one thing to think about is, again, when it comes to these kinds of policies that really regulate on the biggest emitters in our state, who is benefiting and who is losing when it comes to these policies? So for those who are unfamiliar with cap and trade, it basically says that we need to, as a whole in the state of California, create a cap on emissions that decreases every year over time to get us to some of our targets, right? This is done by allowing the covered facilities, so like Chevron, other big emission producing facilities, to buy allowances that they can trade on a market. So they can, they're given allowances, but they're also allowed to auction off, buy allowances through auctions. The other thing that's a small part of cap and trade is this concept of offsets. You might have heard of red forestry offsets or other kinds of offsets that basically say that we're going to try to reduce carbon and prevent it from being released into the atmosphere. I think the biggest challenge is that the science around offsets is extremely poor, and the support for offsets in general communities is extremely poor. So one thing is that, we can go into more detail another time if you have questions, but how do you prove that these are additional reductions in GHGs? Or are these just things that people were going to do anyway, and you're paying people to maintain the status quo? The science behind them is not so great, as you can see from the hundreds of scientists that signed onto letters to oppose red forestry offsets, and they can lead to incredible human rights abuses for the people whose land they're living on. So there's a lot of things to consider as we think about climate change solutions. What are, again, real solutions that really meet our values, and what are false solutions? Another example I want to give is with dairy digesters. So this is a real big issue in farming communities in the Central Valley, but they create biogas, also known as biomethane, from cow poop, and they're able to generate. They're able to cap those operations and channel that gas into pipelines, but also could be used as biofuel. And so, again, are we trying to do like a little bit less damage, or are we trying to make things healthier? And a lot of times these operations are not serving local communities. So like you'll have a farm that's like a really big farm that makes a ton of money anyways, getting subsidies for dairy digester projects, while local communities in the Central Valley are getting the same amount of pollution they were before. Right? So again, really want to question is people getting, continuing to have nitrates in their groundwater and continuing pollution into the air worth putting money into something like a dairy digester project? So, and then of course there's issues related to climate, right? Like displacement. So whenever you create a project and you create investments, there's always this risk of pushing out the people who've been there for a really long time that have made the community great and have made the community what it is today, right? So just want to say that, yeah, there's a lot of issues that we need to consider when it comes to climate solutions that are not just stuck on just emissions, right? Emissions don't happen in silo. They're not like, you can't just take them alone and address them individually. They have to be seen as a systems approach. Some things that you can take a look at that people are really promoting is, thinking about what is a just transition. And the just transition movement came out of the environmental justice movement. And what it says is, right, we have this dialogue in our country that says that we can't have both the environment and the economy. We have to they're pitted against each other and no one's gonna benefit. We have to choose which one we have to prioritize. And what Just Transition says is that no, we're thinking about shifting our economies. We're thinking about shifting workforce, and we're thinking about shifting the way that we do business in our lives to be healthy and regenerative and balanced. So organization or an alliance that's really big on this is the Climate Justice Alliance. And if you know some of the organizations who are part of it, they're a great resource to tap into to think about, again, how can we push forward to being not just sustainable, but also regenerative. The principles of just transition that are, foundation for some groups like the CJA are, buen vivir. So can everyone live well and have what they need to survive without harming other people? Can we just live simply? Can people have meaningful work? So people are involved in their jobs and can produce and contribute to society in a way that's healthy and productive and not harming other people. Can people have access to things like can we have self-determination? Can we have ownership over our lives and work together as a community to create those policies to govern ourselves? Can we fight for equitable redistribution of resources and power? Can we have regenerative ecological economics? Can we have culture and tradition that really preserves a lot of these values that we have when it comes to EJ and climate justice? We need to build solidarity between different kinds of people, every kind of group of people that's out there. And can we build what we need now? We're not trying to wait for this far off future when things are really bad to start building the new. We need to build the new now. We need to innovate. When we talk about innovation, we think of technology fixes. I mean, that's maybe part of it. We're talking about building really creative solutions that are people-based right now. And so one example you can see on the CJA website is examples of folks from all over the country that are trying to do this just transition concept in their lives. So in Appalachia, there's a group of coal mining workers who are formerly, they don't want to work in the mines anymore. They don't want to work in the extractive economy. They're trying to figure out what kinds of jobs can we shift to? What kinds of energy can we shift to? So they're working together. That's very, very specific to Appalachia to make sure that they can, promote good jobs, healthy living, good homes, and also have clean source of energy to sustain themselves. So lastly, I've been asked to talk about how to make an impact. And again, this might be a little bit different from what we've heard before, but definitely personal individual lifestyle choices can make an impact. I think the biggest thing that it can do is really think about how do we shift consciousness and culture and practices to being more mindful of the impacts that we have on other people and in different ecologies, right? Or the environment. But we have to be careful of saying that individual lifestyle change by itself is going to be the solution that gets us to where we need to go. And I think we have to be careful of thinking about certain kinds of solutions that might actually have some unjust undertones. One thing that people say is well, people should just stop having babies. And I totally get that. But sometimes, I have a kid too, so I totally get that. No, I'm kidding. I love her. But I think the biggest thing to think about is a lot of times those have racial undertones. Let's be real. When we talk about population control, who do people really talk about when it comes to those policies? You're blaming low-income folks. People are blaming people of color. They're blaming folks in the global south. I think we have to be very careful about when we talk about policies that seem very general, really who is going to be impacted and who's going to be biased against. But yeah, definitely ride bikes and eat less meat and do all this other stuff that people talked about before. Those are all definitely good things to do. But from our perspective, we also know that we are not the biggest problem in the room. Like, who are the biggest polluters that are really impacting larger, emissions production, right? Like, some of these big companies are producing some of the most emissions, like way more, like a huge majority of the emissions in our country. And these are the folks that really need to be held accountable when it comes to climate change. So the things that we do are we organize, right? Like, everyone, when they join organizations, there's a ton in Southern California that you can join that work block on block, neighbor to neighbor in communities to like educate one another, build up our skills, and advocate for the changes that we need in our communities. We rally in Sacramento. We bring people from all over the state to like push for these kinds of policies that we need. We build relationships with legislators to make sure that they're doing right by our communities and they're respecting the voices of people most impacted. And there's a lot of other things you can do, especially as folks who are in academia. My favorite thing is, if you can, work with the organization to write letters. Can you write an op-ed or a scientific report that can back up some of the, things that people are working on? As someone from a nonprofit organization, having the researcher is really hard to get. So you can provide so much, capacity by providing like writing academic research. You can engage in social media strategies. Twitter is a really big strategy these days of like talking to your legislator. You can talk to anybody on Twitter these days. You can share information on different forms of social media. You can testify at a legislative committee hearing. For those who like to show that people are really against an issue, come to Sacramento if you can and show up at a hearing and say like, I agree with this, or even testify if you can. If you can't do that, you can also go to your district representative in each part of the state and talk to them about what you care about. And that also puts pressure on people to take action. You can volunteer, you can provide resources, and donate to good organizations. Like the organizations who get the most money aren't making the most radical change. They're the ones making the most safest status quo strategies available, to be frank. The groups that are scrappy, the groups that are making the most radical change, and I'm talking about radical, I mean like the ones that are producing the change that really makes the biggest difference, are not the ones who are getting funded because they don't seem safe and they don't seem like, palatable to the average person. So really support orgs that are doing good work. And definitely, again, talk to your friends, talk to community members about solutions that not just address mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. I wanted to give examples of community solutions I thought are really good examples. So one is that in San Francisco, people took over public land that was owned by the public utility and said, we're going to create a community garden here. So we're going to create access to our own food that's in our neighborhood. We're not getting meat from the Central Valley shipped up here that creates greater harms, right? It's going to have cultural knowledge. It's called the Hummingbird Farm. We can actually practice our cultural traditions here and get herbs for medicine through our garden. And these are things run and led and created by community members. This is another example of folks in the Bay Area where they're creating their own solar cooperatives. So they're working together to leverage their own resources to put solar on certain homes that they can all feed into and they all benefit from. So you're creating localized, powerful solutions that are not based on these mainstream solutions that are not, really generating benefits for people. So I just want to leave it there as, again, food for thought as you talk about ways in which you can take action and what it really means to address climate justice. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me below. I'm at tiffany@caleja.org. Again, we're Ceja, so it's like eyebrow in Spanish, like Ceja, but our email address is a little bit different. And then we also create a toolkit on SB 1000, which is a law that integrates environmental justice goals into general plans. That is not necessarily climate justice focused, but it does provide you with really good principles on how to plan for EJs. So thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.